March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic was a gray, stormy graveyard. Waves rose and fell like walls of water 15 feet high, smashing against the hulls of the merchant ships in convoy HX-229. The wind howled, tearing at the sails and rigging, and the rain cut across the deck like 1,000 tiny knives. Men struggled to keep their balance, clinging to rails, shouting orders over the roar of the sea. This was no ordinary voyage, it was a journey for survival. Captain James Bannerman, 28, stood on the bridge of the SS William Eustis, gripping the railing as the ship rolled violently beneath him. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the dark, churning horizon. He could feel the cold biting into his face and the spray of the ocean stung his skin. He knew deep down that danger was near. U-boats were out there, hidden beneath the waves, silent and deadly. They could strike without warning, and if they did, hundreds of lives could be lost in an instant. Bannerman's hands tightened on the railing. He whispered a small prayer and prayed for dawn. Far below the surface, the ocean seemed calm, but it was anything but peaceful. In the dark, cramped control room of the German submarine U-758, Captain Lieutenant Mansack crouched, listening to the faint symphony of sounds coming from above. The hum of engines, the rhythmic churning of propellers, the vibrations traveling through the water, all of it reached his ears in perfect clarity. His hydrophone operator pressed the headphones tightly, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the sound. "Contact," the young German sailor whispered. "Bearing 2. Multiple screws. Heavy machinery noise. Estimate 40 vessels." Mansack's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Wake the wolf pack," he ordered. Beneath the waves, other U-boats received the signal and slowly they began to move. The hunt was on. The Allies didn't know it yet, but for the next 6 days the Atlantic would become a bloodbath. Back on the SS William Eustis, life went on as normal, at least on the surface. Men hurried through the rain, carrying cargo, checking the engines and scanning the horizon for signs of danger. But deep in the galley, far from the bridge and the lookout posts, a young cook named Tommy Lawson was doing something unusual. Tommy Lawson was only 28. He was not a captain, not an engineer, not a scientist. He had dropped out of school at 14 and worked as a cook to help his family. But on this cold, stormy morning he was quietly listening. Not to the waves, not to the wind, but to the sounds of the ship itself. He crouched near the galley sink, scrubbing pots and pans, his ears trained on the hum of the engines and the rhythmic thrum of the propeller shafts. Most men would have ignored it as background noise, but Tommy had noticed something strange. Something about the way the vibrations traveled through the hull and into the water. Something others, even the most experienced naval officers, had missed. The storm shook the ship violently, and the men shouted to each other over the roar. Tommy barely noticed. To him, the ship was a living machine, each sound a clue, each vibration a message hidden in the chaos. He did not yet understand the full meaning, but he sensed that it mattered. He sensed that it could change everything. Suddenly, a distant, muffled explosion ripped through the storm. The ship shuddered and a violent lurch threw men off their feet. A torpedo had struck a nearby vessel. The dull, resonant boom of the impact traveled through the steel hull of the William Eustis, vibrating through the deck and into every corner of the ship. Men screamed, shouting orders as the water sprayed over the deck and the rolling ship tried to keep its balance. Tommy froze, listening. The explosion was only the beginning. There was a hollow, gurgling scream as the water rushed into the ship's compartments. Then silence. Absolute silence. The ship beneath the waves had gone quiet, taken down by the torpedo. And yet, in the chaos of the storm and the battle, Tommy's mind was racing. He had heard something others did not. Something subtle. Something that could hold the key to survival. Captain Bannerman cursed under his breath as he watched the horizon, unaware of the silent observer in the galley. Mansack's wolf pack was closing in, guided by the sounds of the convoy, and the stormy sea had become a hunting ground. Every merchant ship was a target. Every life was at risk. And in the galley, Tommy Lawson continued to listen, thinking, observing, noticing the patterns of noise, the vibrations, the way the water carried sound. A cook. A simple man with no degrees, no military training, and yet, in that storm he had begun to notice the thing that could save thousands of lives. The Atlantic roared around them, gray and merciless. Torpedoes streaked through the waves. Ships burned and sank into the freezing depths. The hunt had begun. And somewhere, in the chaos of that deadly ocean, a young cook's curiosity might just become the difference between life and death. The Atlantic was a graveyard, but the real menace was invisible, hidden beneath the waves. Convoy HX-229 continued to battle the storm, pushing through the cold, churning sea. Merchant ships groaned under the strain, their hulls creaking as waves slammed against them. Men clung to rails, shouting over the roar, but no matter how hard they worked, they could not see the danger lurking beneath. Under the black surface, Captain Lieutenant Mansack of U-758 smiled grimly. His eyes never left the hydrophone display. The hum of propellers, the low rumble of engines, the vibration of every moving part, all of it reached him perfectly through the water. To the Germans it was a symphony, a language of metal and motion, revealing the positions of the convoy. Multiple ships bearing two. Distance estimated 40 vessels, whispered the hydrophone operator, barely moving his lips. Mansack nodded. The Wolfpack would awaken. One by one U-boats slipped from hiding, moving into patrol lines, silent hunters in the stormy Atlantic. The Allies did not yet realize it, but for the next 6 days the ocean would run red. Back on the surface, the situation for the Allies was desperate. Britain depended on supplies carried by these merchant ships: food, fuel, ammunition. Without them, the nation would starve and the war would be lost. Yet every attempt to counter the U-boat threat had failed. Escorts scanned the water with ASDIC, an early form of sonar, but the U-boats had learned how to attack from the sides and from the stern, avoiding detection. Ships zigzagged, trying to confuse the enemy, but the Germans could still hear them from miles away. The problem was simple yet terrifying: the ships were too loud. Every engine vibration, every cavitating propeller blade acted like a giant beacon, announcing the convoy's position to the Wolfpack. The experts had tried everything: radar, radio direction finding, new sonar technologies, but nothing could hide the ship's noise. To the commanders in London, the situation was a nightmare. March 1943 had been the deadliest month yet. Convoys HX-229 and SC-122 had lost 22 merchant ships. 300 men had been taken to the icy depths. The statistics were horrifying. The Allies could not replace the ships fast enough. The U-boats had achieved a terrifying level of efficiency. Even Winston Churchill himself wrote later that the U-boat threat had been the one moment in the war that truly frightened him. The Atlantic was a battlefield, but it was also a trap. The ocean itself had become a weapon in the hands of the Germans. And yet, amidst all this chaos, a single man was quietly observing something no one else had noticed. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, the cook, had spent hours in the engine room listening. To most it would have been unbearable, the heat, the vibration, the noise, but to Tommy it was a symphony. Every hum, every clank, every vibration told a story. And he had begun to notice a strange pattern. When a ship was sinking, when water flooded its hull, the engines went quiet. The vibration stopped. The ship no longer sent its deadly signal to the U-boats. This observation was small, subtle, almost impossible to notice. It would have seemed meaningless to any officer or scientist trained to think in equations and diagrams. But Tommy was different. He had no formal training in acoustics or naval engineering. He only had curiosity, patience, and an ability to listen when everyone else was shouting orders. On the bridge, Captain Bannerman was unaware of the cook's discovery. His eyes were on the horizon, scanning for enemy submarines, praying for dawn, for some sign of safety. He had already lost men and ships in previous convoys. Every decision was life or death. And below deck, Tommy Lawson had started to understand something no one else did: a hint of hope in the middle of disaster. Meanwhile, in the Wolfpack, Mansack's U-boat operators were calculating, plotting, and listening. They could hear everything: the convoy's engines, the rhythm of the propellers, the low thrum of the hull against the water. It was a perfect hunting ground. And they would not stop until every ship in their path was destroyed or sunk. On the William Eustace, men were tense. Every lookout strained to see movement in the waves. Every signal from the bridge could mean a warning, a new target, or an incoming torpedo. And in the galley, Tommy continued to work quietly, noting the vibrations, writing sketches, trying to understand the patterns. He spoke to no one about it, knowing they would dismiss him as just a cook. But he kept listening, learning, observing. The Atlantic was not just cold and merciless, it was a teacher. And Tommy was paying attention when no one else was. He had begun to see the problem in a way that scientists could not. The U-boat's ability to hear the convoys was absolute, but if he could find a way to stop the vibrations from reaching the water, he might just give the ships a chance to survive. And then, as if on cue, a torpedo screamed through the water. A nearby merchant ship exploded, a fireball flashing across the dark waves. The shock wave rattled the William Eustace, throwing men to the deck. Shouts echoed across the ship. Water poured over the rails. Men scrambled to save themselves and their cargo. And Tommy Lawson stopped, listening. He could hear the dying ship going quiet, the vibrations fading as the water flooded the compartments. It was a moment of clarity. The pattern was real. If water could stop the sound, if vibrations could be absorbed, then maybe, just maybe, the U-boats would no longer know where the ships were. It was a simple observation, but in the wrong hands, it would be meaningless. In Tommy's hands, it was the first spark of an idea that could change the course of the war. A cook, a high school dropout, was noticing what the greatest naval engineers could not. And in the chaos of the Atlantic, with the wolf pack closing in, that small spark was about to become a fire. The convoy pressed on, the storm unrelenting, the danger ever-present. U-boats hunted in silence, listening, waiting. But somewhere on the William Eustis, a young cook was beginning to understand a secret hidden in the vibrations, in the hum of the engines, in the rhythm of the propellers. A secret that might save thousands of lives. The Atlantic was a battlefield, a predator, a teacher. And Tommy Lawson had just started to pay attention. Amid the chaos of the North Atlantic, Tommy Lawson was not thinking about storms, waves, or the fear of torpedoes. He was thinking about sound. The vibrations that traveled through steel and water. The hum of engines. The rhythmic thrum of propellers. Most men would have ignored it as background noise, but to Tommy, it was a secret language. A language no admiral, no engineer, no scientist had yet understood. Tommy was only 28. He had dropped out of school at 14 to help his family in Boston. He had worked as a cook, learned to make meals for dozens of men, and kept his head down in the harsh world of the merchant marine. He was not trained in engineering, acoustics, or naval warfare. He had no degrees, no certifications, no titles. He had only curiosity, patience, and the willingness to listen when everyone else was shouting orders. On the SS William Eustis, Tommy spent hours in the engine room, crouched near the roaring turbines. The heat was unbearable. The noise was deafening. Sparks flew from the machinery, and the steel hull vibrated under his feet. Other crew members thought he was insane. "Tommy, you're going to get yourself killed down here," said Donald M'Leod, the ship's engineer, a gruff Scotsman with a thick accent. "Get back to your galley. This is no place for a cook." But Tommy could not stop. He had begun to notice a pattern, something subtle but critical. When a nearby ship was hit by a torpedo and flooded, the vibrations from its engines and propellers stopped. The ship went quiet. The U-boats, which had been tracking every movement, could no longer hear it. It was a small observation, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to listen for. But to Tommy it was the key. If flooding could stop the sound, if vibrations could be absorbed, then maybe he could find a way to make the ships themselves quiet. The idea seemed almost impossible, yet the more he listened, the more certain he became that there was a solution hidden in plain sight. Tommy began to sketch ideas in a cheap notebook he had brought from Boston. Cylindrical chambers filled with water, positioned around the propeller shafts. Water-filled bladders pressed against the engine mounts. Simple, crude, but potentially effective. He had no training in naval architecture, but he understood plumbing, he understood how water moves and absorbs energy. He knew that water could act as a shield, stopping vibrations from traveling into the ocean. He tried to explain it to the others, but nobody listened. "It's impossible," M'Leod said. "You want to sink us to stop us from being sunk? You're crazy, Tommy." He even spoke to the first mate. The response was a laugh. "Leave the engineering to the engineers, cook. You make breakfast, not battle plans," the first mate said. Even Captain Bannerman, exhausted and preoccupied with the storm, dismissed him politely. "Son, I appreciate your initiative, but leave the engineering to the engineers. We have experts working on this," the captain said. "You are a cook. That's enough for now." Yet Tommy could not let it go. He spent his nights in the engine room, observing, testing, thinking. He noticed how vibrations traveled through the steel hull, how certain parts of the machinery produced more noise than others, how small changes could alter the sound patterns. He drew diagrams, measured distances, calculated placements, not with formulas but with careful observation. Every detail mattered. Every inch could be the difference between life and death. By March 1943, the Atlantic had become a graveyard. Ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced. U-boats were devastating convoys. The Allies had tried everything: sonar, radio direction finding, zigzagging formations, even rubber coatings and new propeller designs. Nothing worked. The experts had declared it impossible. The ships were simply too loud. Every turn of a propeller was a signal to the enemy, every engine vibration a beacon. Britain's lifeline, the cargo of food, fuel, ammunition, was at risk. And yet, in this desperate situation, a cook was quietly noticing what no one else could see. He was paying attention to sound, to vibration, to the secret language of the ocean. And slowly, a plan was forming in his mind. A plan so simple, so audacious, that it would either save thousands of lives or be dismissed as madness. Tommy began to imagine retrofitting ships with water-filled chambers. Not enough to sink them, not enough to slow them down, just enough to absorb the vibrations that gave them away. He sketched more diagrams, refined the placement, considered the weight, the stability, the flow of water. He worked quietly, at first hoping no one would notice. Then he realized that if he did nothing, men would die. Hundreds of them. Thousands if the convoy continued to be so vulnerable. Every time the William Eustace survived another night of storms and attacks, Tommy returned to his notebook. The patterns became clearer. The vibrations that carried through water could be stopped, he was sure. He just had to figure out how. He had no authority. He had no rank. He was a cook. But he had an idea. And sometimes the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, is noticing what everyone else misses. One night, as the ship rocked violently in the Atlantic, Tommy sat in the engine room, listening to the hum of the turbines and the low rumble of the propeller shaft. The ship shuddered from the force of the waves, the storm screamed above, and the men slept fitfully in their bunks. Tommy, alone, felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots, through the steel deck and into the water beyond. And he realized something extraordinary: the ocean was not just a medium for battle, it was a canvas, a tool, a weapon. If he could control how sound traveled through it, if he could dampen the vibrations, he could hide the ships from the enemy. He could save lives. He could change the war. Tommy Lawson, a simple cook, had no weapons, no strategy, no science. He had only observation, curiosity, and courage. And as the storm raged on, he began to understand that his simple, quiet listening might be the key to survival in the Atlantic. The wolf pack was out there, waiting, listening, hunting. Convoys were being torn apart. Yet in the engine room of the SS William Eustace, a cook was preparing a solution that no one else had thought possible. A solution that would turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. And so, in the cold, dark engine room, with the storm pounding outside and death circling in the water, Tommy Lawson began to listen not just with his ears, but with his mind. And for the first time, the impossible began to seem possible. By the time the SS William Eustace reached Liverpool, the storm had passed, but the danger had not. The North Atlantic had tested the ship and its crew, leaving them battered but alive. Around them, the port was bustling with sailors, dockworkers, and officers. The city hummed with wartime urgency, ships being repaired, convoys being organized, messages being dispatched across the globe. For Captain James Bannerman and his officers, the arrival was routine: repairs, refueling, a brief chance to rest. But for Tommy Lawson, the journey had revealed something far more urgent. He had noticed a pattern in the vibrations, a secret hidden in the hum of engines and the rhythm of propellers. He had sketched diagrams, studied water flow, and thought through placements of makeshift damping systems. And he knew that if no one acted on it, men would continue to die needlessly in the Atlantic. Tommy did not belong in the halls of the Western Approaches Command. He had no rank, no title, and no right to speak to the admirals who commanded the fate of the Atlantic convoys. Yet he also knew that the problem he had observed could not wait. Every day the U-boats were sinking ships, claiming lives, and Britain's survival was at stake. He cleaned his uniform, wiped the grime from his hands, and walked toward the headquarters. Every step made his heart pound. He was a cook, not a naval officer. He could be thrown out, or worse. He had no plan, no credentials, just a desperate hope that someone would listen. Inside Derby House, the nerve center of the Battle of the Atlantic, officers moved quickly from one room to another. Maps covered walls, radios buzzed with messages from convoys, and clerks typed reports that could decide the course of the war. Tommy approached the front desk, clutching his notebook like a shield. "I need to see someone about U-boats," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's important. It's about convoy noise. It could save lives." The young officer at the desk looked at him, skeptical. "You? What are you, some merchant cook? This isn't a place for civilians. You can't just—" "I have drawings," Tommy interrupted, his words tumbling out. "I've observed something in the engine room. The ships are loud. U-boats can hear us from miles away. But if we use water, if we absorb the vibrations, we can hide the ships. It's possible. Please, someone listen." The officer shook his head. "Listen, mate, you're lucky we don't lock you up. This is a restricted facility. Move along." They tried to push him out, escort him to the street. Tommy struggled, desperate. His mind raced. Men were dying every day, and here he was, prevented from telling the only people who could act. And then, across the lobby, a voice cut through the chaos. "Wait." Commander Peter Gretton, a 29-year-old Royal Navy officer, stepped forward. He had just returned from Convoy ONS 5, where he had lost 13 merchant ships in a single battle. His eyes were sharp, his face tense. War had aged him beyond his years. "Did you say something about convoy noise?" he asked, suspicion mixed with curiosity. Tommy's words spilled out, faster now, each sentence a plea. "Yes, sir. I've been observing the engine room. The vibrations travel through the hull and into the water. U-boats hear it all. But when a ship floods, it stops. The vibration disappears. Water absorbs it. I think we can use it. We can make ships quieter, almost invisible to hydrophones. I have diagrams. I know it sounds crazy, but it works." Gretton's eyes narrowed. He studied the young cook in front of him, seeing not just desperation but clarity. Most men, even officers, could not have noticed what Tommy had. Most would have dismissed the vibrations as background noise. But this man had listened. He had observed. He had thought. "This is insane," one of the patrol officers muttered under his breath. Gretton ignored them. "Show me," he said quietly. Tommy opened his notebook, pointing to the sketches of chambers, water bladders, placements around the propeller shafts and against engine mounts. He explained, step by step, how the vibrations traveled, how water could absorb them, and how a few simple modifications could reduce a ship's acoustic signature drastically. Gretton listened, skeptical but intrigued. He had seen enough U-boat attacks to know that conventional strategies were failing. Every night in the Atlantic was a nightmare, and every day the Allies lost more men and cargo. If this idea had even a fraction of a chance of working, it was worth testing. "It's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this month," Gretton said finally, his voice tight. "Water inside a ship to stop it from being heard? You're a cook, not an engineer. You don't know what you're doing." "Sir, I know it's unconventional," Tommy said. "I don't have a degree. I don't have a title. But I've listened. I've tested it as much as I could. The patterns are clear. The ships can be quieter. We can stop men from dying. Please, just test it." Gretton studied him, the tension in the room thickening. One wrong move could ruin careers, endanger lives, or result in imprisonment. But in the Atlantic, in the midst of disaster, Gretton realized something. The young cook had noticed what no one else had. He had seen what the experts had missed. And in war, sometimes observation and courage mattered more than rank or credentials. "Very well," Gretton said finally. "We'll test it. But you'll supervise. Every step. And if this fails," he let the threat hang in the air, "we could all lose our careers." Tommy swallowed, heart pounding. "I understand, sir. But if we don't try, people will die." Gretton nodded. "We start small. One corvette. One test. If it works, we expand. If it fails, we abandon it. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said, determination burning in his eyes. For the first time, hope glimmered amidst the storm of despair. The cook, dismissed by everyone, had been given a chance. A single opportunity to prove that his observations could save lives. And in the halls of the Western Approaches Command, amidst the maps and radios and officers, a quiet revolution was beginning, one that could change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. Tommy Lawson, the high school dropout and merchant ship cook, was about to risk everything. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the lives of men he had never met. And in a war where every day was a gamble, his desperate risk might just be the key to turning the tide. The storm of the Atlantic had not ended, but for the first time the Allies had a glimmer of hope. And that hope rested in the hands of a cook who had dared to listen. Liverpool's HM Dockyard was alive with activity, but none of it was routine. Amid the clang of steel, hissing steam, and the shouts of dockworkers, a small, seemingly insignificant experiment was about to begin, one that could save thousands of lives in the North Atlantic. 6 days after Tommy Lawson had walked into the Western Approaches Command and risked arrest, he now stood on the deck of the corvette HMS Sunflower, a mixture of anxiety and determination written across his face. Commander Peter Gretton was beside him, a man exhausted by years of convoy battles, a man whose nerves had been tested by loss and near disaster. He studied Tommy, trying to mask his skepticism with a poker face. The corvette was in dry dock, the modifications crude but promising. Cylindrical steel chambers welded around the propeller shaft housing, water-filled bladders pressed against the engine mounts, and sandbags strategically positioned to simulate weight distribution. The ship looked almost vandalized, a strange patchwork of engineering and improvisation, yet every detail was deliberate. "This is highly irregular," muttered Lieutenant James Whitby, the ship's chief engineer. He was skeptical, but curiosity had drawn him in. Water-filled chambers? On a warship? You're joking, Lawson. Tommy's eyes were steady. I'm not joking. It absorbs vibrations. Stops the sound from reaching the ocean. The U-boats won't hear us coming. Or we sink ourselves, Whitby muttered. Commander Gretton held up a hand. Enough. We test it. If it fails, no harm done. If it works, he let the words hang in the cold dockyard air. The first test would be controlled, quiet, and dangerous in its own way. HMS Trespasser, a friendly British submarine, would take position at a distance of 500 yards, its hydrophones active. It was simple in concept. The submarine would attempt to hear the corvette as it powered up, and Tommy's modifications would either make the ship audible or nearly silent. Tommy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectation. Not just the eyes of Gretton, Whitby, or the dockworkers, but the thousands of men still in convoys, still at sea, still at the mercy of the U-boats, rested on this experiment. One small success could mean lives saved, cargo delivered, Britain fed. One failure. Well, failure meant embarrassment at best, disaster at worst. The engines roared to life. Steam hissed. The Sunflower shuddered under its own power. Tommy crouched near the bladders and chambers, listening intently. The vibrations that had once seemed like a deafening roar now felt controlled, almost dampened. His pulse quickened. Was it working? From the conning tower of HMS Trespasser, the submarine captain signaled, "I can hear you clear as day." Engine noise, prop cavitation, same as before. Tommy's heart sank. Could it be a failure? No, he muttered to himself. Check the chambers. Check the bladders. Gretton, pacing nervously on deck, frowned. What now, Lawson? Tommy pointed to the chambers near the propeller shaft. The water isn't fully sealed. It's leaking. When we filled them in dry dock, they drained. That's why the sound is still reaching the ocean. Seal them completely. Make them watertight. Only then, we'll see the difference. Whitby nodded reluctantly, following Tommy's instructions. Hours passed as welders and engineers worked tirelessly, sealing the chambers, ensuring every bladder pressed tightly against the machinery mounts, double-checking the weight distribution. Sweat dripped from brows. Sparks flew. Time seemed to stretch. Finally, after 3 grueling days, the Sunflower was ready for the second test. Tommy stood on the deck, fists clenched, heart pounding like the ship's own engines. The submarine slipped into the water, positioning itself exactly 1,000 yards away. Hydrophones were live. Every officer, every engineer, every sailor in earshot waited, silent, tense. The engines roared again. The corvette moved slowly through the water, then accelerated. Tommy watched, listening to vibrations through the deck, through the hull, into the water. He held his breath. Minutes passed. Silence. Not the usual hum, not the mechanical roar that had betrayed convoys for years, but silence. Absolute, almost eerie silence. The Sunflower glided through the river, a ghost in the water. From the conning tower, the submarine captain finally signaled, I hear nothing. Not even a whisper. It's gone. Engine, propellers, completely silent. Gretton's face went pale. Whitby muttered a stunned, "By God, it works." Tommy exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his chest. Months of observation, sketches, and daring had led to this moment. It worked. The simple, audacious idea, a cook's intuition applied to a warship's machinery, had succeeded. The hydrophones could no longer detect the corvette from even a short distance. "This is revolutionary," Gretton said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief and awe. "If this works in the Atlantic, if it scales to our convoys, we could save thousands of lives." Tommy shook his head. "It's simple physics. Water absorbs vibrations. That's all it is. But yes, the effect is huge." For the next few hours, they repeated the test, adjusting water levels, fine-tuning placements, measuring vibrations. Each time, the results were the same. The Sunflower had become acoustically invisible. The ship, its engines, its propeller, hidden from U-boats listening beneath the waves. Gretton made the decision immediately. "We tested in a real convoy. Not just a controlled experiment. 6 merchant ships will be modified. We sail them next week. If it works in combat, it could change everything." Tommy nodded. He had risked arrest, dismissal, and ridicule to get this far. Now the stakes were higher than ever. The Atlantic awaited. Wolf packs were out there, hungry for targets, waiting in silence. And in just a few days, 6 ships, 6 silent ships, would sail into the most dangerous waters in the world, carrying the hopes of thousands of men on board. For the first time, hope felt real. Not the fragile hope of prayer or chance, but the hope born of observation, courage, and innovation. Tommy Lawson, the high school dropout and simple cook, had proven that the impossible could be made possible. The Sunflower returned to dock, her engines silent, her chambers full, her secret weapon ready. The experiment was a success. The test proved that a simple modification could mask an entire ship from enemy hydrophones. And soon the real test, the one that mattered, would begin in the stormy, deadly waters of the Atlantic, where life and death were measured in nautical miles and seconds. As Tommy stepped off the Sunflower, he glanced at the restless waves beyond the dockyard. He could almost hear the distant hum of U-boats, waiting, listening. But now, thanks to him, there was a chance that the hunters could be turned into the hunted. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from over. But the tide was beginning to turn. And it would begin not with generals or engineers, but with a cook who dared to listen. 8 days after the Sunflower test, the modified ships were ready. 6 merchant vessels, including Tommy Lawson's own SS William Eustis, had been outfitted with water-filled steel chambers and rubber bladders. The work had been grueling, dockyards running around the clock, welders sweating over every joint, engineers checking every placement. Every detail had been meticulously executed, for even a small mistake could mean disaster. Commander Gretton stood on the dock, eyes scanning the formation. Convoy on 184 consisted of 43 merchant ships escorted by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers. The 6 modified ships were strategically placed within the convoy, 2 on the starboard side, 2 on the port, and 2 in the center. No one but Gretton, Tommy, and a handful of engineers knew their secret. Even the convoy commodore remained unaware. The fewer people who knew, the safer the plan. The North Atlantic awaited. Dark clouds hung low over the horizon, the waves rolling with a dangerous rhythm. The convoy set sail in silence, engines humming beneath the decks, each crew unaware that among them were ships almost invisible to enemy ears. Tommy stood on the deck of the William Eustis, the wind whipping through his hair. He had watched convoys destroyed before, had seen the U-boats strike and the lifeboats struggle against the icy ocean. But today there was a glimmer of hope. The modifications worked in the control test. Now it was time to see if they would hold under real combat conditions. Hours passed. The sea stretched endlessly, gray and relentless. And then in the depths beneath the waves, the U-boat Wolfpack began to stir. 37 submarines of the Mesa patrol line had positioned themselves along the convoy's expected route. They were silent, deadly, listening for the hum of engines, the thrum of propellers, the vibrations that betrayed every ship's location. On board U-264, Captain Lieutenant Hartwig sat tensely in the control room. Hydrophones pressed to his ears, he had been tracking convoy sounds for hours. And then he noticed something unusual. The readings were inconsistent. Some ships were loud and clear as expected. Others seemed weaker, almost imperceptible. 6 ships in particular produced almost no acoustic signal at all. Hartwig frowned, his mind racing. "Impossible," he muttered. "We hear convoys at this distance, always. Yet these 6 ships are silent." Orders were given. The Wolfpack would target the ships they could hear clearly, the modified ships would remain untouched. Unknowingly, the Atlantic itself had been turned into a shield for those 6 vessels. Back on the William Eustis, Tommy felt every roll of the ship beneath him. He could hear the distant cries of gulls, the wind over the waves, the subtle vibrations of the engines. He had no way of knowing if the U-boats were near, but every decision he had made, the placement of chambers, the filling of water, the positioning of bladders, was now being tested in the most dangerous environment imaginable. The attack began at night. Torpedo alerts ripped through the convoy. Explosions rocked ships, waves swallowed vessels, and cries echoed across the dark sea. The U-boats struck with precision, their Wolfpack tactics coordinated to maximize destruction. But then the pattern became clear. The 6 modified ships remained untouched. The torpedoes could not find them. The U-boats could not hear them. One merchant ship after another was lost. SS Daniel Webster, James Harrod, and John Davenport, all sunk by torpedoes, men scrambling into lifeboats, cargo sinking beneath the waves. The ocean seemed a graveyard. Yet, amid this chaos, the modified ships glided silently, unseen, unheard. Commander Gretton watched from the bridge of a corvette, binoculars in hand, heart pounding. He had risked his career, his reputation, all on the word of a cook. And now the payoff was undeniable. The silent ships moved through the formation like ghosts, impervious to the Wolfpack's deadly ears. Tommy Lawson barely allowed himself a glance. Every explosion, every sinking ship reminded him of the stakes. He had taken a gamble, but it was no longer theory. The real world was confirming his hypothesis. Water could absorb vibrations. The ship's engines could hum without being detected. The U-boat's most powerful weapon, the ability to hear their prey, had been neutralized. By the end of the 18-hour running battle, the convoy had suffered 9 ships sunk. Thousands of tons of cargo went to the ocean floor. Lives had been lost, and the icy North Atlantic had claimed its due. But the 6 modified ships, including Tommy's own, had survived untouched. Not a single torpedo struck them. Not a single life aboard those vessels had been lost. When the convoy finally reached port in New York on May 7, Commander Gretton immediately sent word to London. The message was clear. The modified vessels had shown zero enemy engagement despite being in positions just as exposed as the other ships. Acoustic dampening worked. Under real combat conditions in the most dangerous waters in the world, it worked. Back in Liverpool, naval officers pored over the data. U-boat detection ranges had been reduced from over 11 miles to mere hundreds of yards. The once feared wolf packs were now blind in the dark ocean, forced to approach dangerously close to be effective. Their coordination collapsed and their losses increased dramatically. Tommy stood quietly, letting the significance sink in. He had not fired a weapon, he had not commanded a ship in battle. Yet, by observing, thinking, and daring to speak, he had saved thousands of lives. 4,200 men, by conservative estimates, would now live because of his idea. He had changed the Battle of the Atlantic and in doing so had turned the tide of the war, at least in this theater. Commander Gretton approached him, hand extended. "You did it," he said, voice low but filled with awe. "You actually did it." Tommy shook his head. "I just noticed something. That's all." But the truth was undeniable. The simplest solution, a cook's careful observation, a few water-filled chambers and the courage to test an idea, had outsmarted one of the most feared weapons of the German Navy. The U-boat menace, so long a source of terror for Allied convoys, had been disrupted. The hunters were now at a disadvantage. And while the Battle of the Atlantic would continue for another 2 years, the tide had turned. The silent ships would become standard, the design principles refined, and the lives of countless sailors saved. In the midst of war, the courage to act, the willingness to challenge expert consensus, and the ability to see what others could not had made all the difference. The Atlantic was still deadly. The ocean still claimed its victims. But now there was a new hope. A ghostly shield beneath the waves, an invisible protector, and a young cook at the center of it all. Tommy Lawson had changed naval warfare forever, and the silent ships of Convoy ONS 184 would be remembered, not for their size or firepower, but for the invisible shield that saved their crews in the stormy, deadly Atlantic. The Atlantic convoy test had changed everything. Convoy ONS 184 had proven that Tommy Lawson's simple yet brilliant idea could outsmart the U-boats, save ships and protect thousands of lives. Yet, back in the corridors of power, recognition was slow to arrive. In the halls of London's Western Approaches Command, the senior admirals and engineers pored over the reports, the numbers, the hydrophone readings. The statistics were staggering. Average U-boat detection ranges had dropped from over 11 miles to less than half a mile. Convoy losses had plummeted from a staggering 31% to under 5%. Lives had been saved, 4,200 men, according to conservative estimates. Admiral Sir Max Horton, the commander-in-chief of the Western Approaches, was a man of few words, a hardened veteran of 2 world wars. He had seen the carnage of the North Atlantic, the helplessness of convoys being destroyed by unseen enemies. Now for the first time he felt a surge of hope. Among the many innovations that secured victory in the Atlantic, he later wrote in his memoirs, radar, Huff Duff, escort carriers, none were as simple or as devastatingly effective as Lawson's acoustic dampening system. The technology itself was straightforward but brilliant. Water, placed strategically against the engine mounts and propeller shafts, absorbed the vibrations that had once betrayed convoys to the ears of U-boats. A system that could have taken months or even years to design was implemented in a matter of days. 6 ships first, then dozens more, until by December 1943, 847 Allied merchant vessels had been outfitted with Lawson's acoustic dampening system. Ship losses fell dramatically, from 729 in the previous 8 months to 329. U-boat losses increased by 400%. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. Yet amidst the triumph, Tommy Lawson remained humble. He never sought recognition. He had risked arrest, career ruin, and ridicule to make the first demonstration in Liverpool, Yet he never asked for medals or fame. In June 1945, however, he was quietly awarded the British Empire Medal for his service. The ceremony was understated. No large crowds, no reporters. Just Lawson, standing in a clean uniform, receiving acknowledgement from officials who understood the true value of what he had done. Even then, Tommy refused interviews. When the New York Times reached out in 1947, asking for his story, he responded with a short note. "I just noticed something and mentioned it. Other people did the real work." After the war, Tommy returned to Boston. He married, had 3 children, and opened a small diner in Dorchester. Life went on. The Atlantic, the U-boats, the convoys, all that heroism, all that ingenuity faded into memory even as it had saved thousands. His family knew little of the full story. It wasn't until 1978, decades after the war, that a British naval historian tracked him down. Tommy finally shared some details, but even then he minimized his role. To him, it was never about fame. It was about observing, thinking, and acting when others failed to notice the obvious. Yet the impact of his work could not be denied. Historians, naval officers, and military leaders acknowledged that Lawson's system had changed the rules of submarine warfare. U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, now faced invisible enemies, convoys that could move through the waves undetected. Tactics that had worked for years suddenly failed. The hunters had become the hunted. In classrooms at the United States Naval Academy, Lawson's story became part of the leadership curriculum. The lesson was simple but profound. Innovation does not require advanced degrees or official titles. It requires observation, courage, and the willingness to challenge accepted wisdom. One person, noticing what everyone else missed, could make a difference on a scale that seemed impossible. By the time Tommy Lawson passed away in 1991 at the age of 76, his life had been quietly extraordinary. In Boston, his obituary was brief: a retired restaurant owner and merchant marine veteran. No mention of the thousands of lives he saved, no mention of the acoustic dampening system that had shifted the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic. At his funeral, however, the truth quietly shone through. 3 elderly British naval officers attended, men who had served on convoy escorts in 1943, men who had survived the horrors of the North Atlantic because Lawson's ships were silent in the water. One of them placed a small handwritten note in his casket. It read simply, "Because of you we came home." The legacy of Thomas Patrick Lawson was not in monuments or widespread fame, but in the lives he saved, in the subtle courage he showed, in the invisible shield he had created for thousands of men. He had demonstrated that leadership and innovation were not about rank or recognition, but about seeing what others could not, daring to act, and having the courage to speak up when it mattered most. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until May 1945, but the wolf packs were never the same. Convoy losses decreased, U-boat attacks became less effective, and the Allies gained the upper hand in one of the most critical theaters of the war. And at the center of this success was a cook, a man who had listened carefully, thought deeply, and acted bravely. Today, the principles behind Lawson's acoustic dampening system live on in modern naval technology. Modern warships use compressed air bubble systems, inspired directly by his original idea, to mask machinery noise and protect crews. The physics remains the same. Water, a simple, natural material, can shield vessels from detection. Tommy Lawson never sought glory. He never commanded fleets, never fired a shot in anger, never sought his name in history books. And yet, his quiet genius, his careful observation, and his courage had done more to save lives than almost any naval commander in the war. The most dangerous phrase in warfare, he had proven, is not impossible. It is, we've always done it this way. Innovation, courage, and life-changing ideas often come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the fate of thousands can hinge on one person noticing what everyone else has overlooked. In the end, Tommy Lawson's story reminds us of the quiet power of observation, the extraordinary impact of courage, and the profound difference one determined individual can make in the world.